They say the gods once walked the earth, not in temples, but in fire that fell from the sky. When the heavens burned, the ice cracked open, and from that storm of light, humanity took its first breath. What if the gods didn't just save us from extinction? What if they became us? The proof still sleeps beneath the glaciers, in bones that remember flame, in blood that carries their echo. Before we begin, make sure to like this video. Share it with someone who still believes the past hides its secrets in plain sight, and subscribe so these lost stories keep finding you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far the memory of that fire still travels. Now, take a breath, and return with me to the moment the sky fell when the gods saved humanity from the ice, and their light became our own. The world was still when it happened. The tundra stretched endless and white, its silence broken only by the sigh of wind over frozen grass. Herds of mammoth moved across the horizon like drifting mountains, their breath rising in silver clouds. For generations, this had been the rhythm of existence, cold, hunger, and endurance. Then, without warning, the heavens opened. A single streak of light tore across the northern sky, brighter than the sun, alive with colors no eye had seen before. It split the air with a sound like the breaking of the earth itself. The frozen plains lit up as if the day had been reborn, shadows fleeing in every direction. For a moment, night ceased to exist. Across the icy valleys, even the beasts fell still, trembling as the ground began to hum beneath them. Then came the roar, a shockwave that rolled over mountains, through forests, into the bones of everything that lived. Trees bent like blades of grass. Birds burst from their roosts in panicked spirals. The air itself seemed to catch fire. Far to the west, the sky blazed orange and gold, then dimmed to a bruised red. Something immense had struck the earth. The gods, it seemed, had spoken in flame. In the aftermath, the world changed its breath. Ash drifted over the plains like gray snow. The air grew thick and strange, heavy with the scent of smoke and stone. Days turned to twilight, even at noon. The sun became a ghostly disk behind a veil of dust. Temperatures fell. Storms raged without end. The long winter that followed would last for generations. But from this disaster came awakening. Those who endured the frozen night began to look at the sky differently, not as emptiness, but as a presence. The heavens were no longer silent. The fiery visitor that split the night became memory, then myth, then origin. In the flicker of every fire that followed, the Neanderthals saw the echo of that first blaze, the gift and the warning left by powers beyond their knowing. And so, amid ruin, a new understanding was born. Fire was not just warmth, it was the language of creation. The ice had nearly taken the world, yet through the fire in the sky, something greater had chosen to save it. The day the heavens burned became the first chapter in humanity's oldest story. How the gods came down to light the way through endless night. In the wake of the fire, the earth seemed to hold its breath. The skies that once shimmered with light now hung heavy and dim, a curtain of dust and ash stretching from horizon to horizon. Days grew short, nights stretched without mercy, and the sun, that ancient guardian, no longer burned with strength. What had begun as a single blazing event in the heavens became an age of silence, an age of cold that swallowed the world whole. Across the vast plains of Ice Age Europe, the winds howled without rest. They scoured the tundra like invisible predators, sculpting frozen ridges where forests once stood. The rivers stopped moving, their surfaces sealed in glass. The ground itself became stone. Mammoths trudged through the endless snow, their dark shapes swallowed by the storm. And in the caves that dotted the limestone cliffs, small flickers of orange light fought against the white void outside. Inside those shelters, Neanderthals guarded their fires as if guarding life itself. Every spark was memory, a reminder of the day the sky had burned, and of the warmth that still lingered from that divine touch. Fire was now more than a tool. It was a covenant. Around its glow, they gathered, wrapped in hides, their breath rising in misty clouds. Beyond the flames, the world belonged to the ice. Within them, the will to survive still burned. Seasons lost their meaning. Summers were pale imitations of warmth, brief respites before winter's hand closed again. The herds migrated farther each year, the hunt more desperate, the cold more cunning. Bones cracked beneath the frost. Even sound seemed frozen, muffled by layers of snow that buried valleys and dreams alike. Yet from this endless winter came transformation. The Neanderthals adapted with a quiet genius. They crafted thicker furs, stronger shelters, sharper tools carved from flint and bone. They learned the rhythm of scarcity, when to move, when to stay, when to wait for the brief return of life beneath the ice. Every breath, every heartbeat, became an act of endurance. And through it all, they looked toward the sky, remembering the fire that once saved them. Perhaps the gods had not abandoned them after all. Perhaps this was a test to see if the flame in their hands could outlast the cold in the heavens. The world had frozen, but in those caves, among the ashes and smoke, the first spark of human perseverance refused to die. It was a quiet defiance against extinction, a whisper to the cosmos itself. We will endure, even when the winter never ends. Across the frozen plains of the last ice age, life clung to the edge of extinction. The wind was a constant companion, whispering across ridges of ice and snow, carrying the voices of a world both ancient and fragile. In this vast, unyielding wilderness lived a species shaped by hardship, refined by cold, and tempered by time, the Neanderthals, the children of stone and bone. For them, survival was not chance. It was an art form. Every movement, every tool, every flicker of fire carried generations of inherited wisdom. Flint was their language, and bone their parchment. With stone blades, they carved the world into something livable. They broke marrow from bones not just for nourishment, but for meaning. Learning to see the value in what others might have overlooked. Theirs was a quiet intelligence, a deep, intuitive mastery of a hostile earth. Within the mouths of limestone caves, their fires glowed like beating hearts. The walls around them became archives of memory, marked with ochre, charcoal, and pigment drawn from the earth itself. Here, the Neanderthals left behind more than survival. They left symbols, handprints, echoes of thought. Each image, each curve of a carved antler, was a conversation with time. These were not mindless beings. They were thinkers, dreamers, artists who understood that to endure, one must remember. Outside, the Ice Age pressed down like a god of endless patience. Yet, the Neanderthals adapted with grace. They hunted in coordinated silence, reading the snow for signs invisible to the untrained eye. Their bodies were built for endurance, powerful limbs, broad chests, lungs shaped for thin air, and long marches through frozen valleys. Their senses were attuned to every sound, every scent, every shift in the wind. And when the storms raged, they did not curse the cold. They listened to it. The ice was their teacher, the stone their tool, the bone their story. Through them, they learned that strength was not domination, but adaptation, not defiance, but harmony with the relentless world around them. They were the architects of survival, shaping tools with precision that would one day teach their distant cousins how to thrive. Long before cities, long before written words, there was this firelight on limestone, the rhythm of stone striking stone, and the quiet hum of thought behind ancient eyes. In that silence, the first whispers of humanity began to form. The Neanderthals were not relics of a forgotten age. They were the first sculptors of endurance, the artists of survival who turned the language of the earth into the story of life itself. Beneath a pale, unending sky, the world moved with the rhythm of survival. The tundra stretched vast and treeless, an ocean of white and silver where every breath was a contest against the wind. Here, life thrived only through unity, precision, and reverence. The Neanderthals knew this better than any creature that walked the earth. For them, the hunt was not violence, it was worship. The great herds roamed the frozen plains like living storms. Mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses carved paths through the snow, their migrations marking the seasons that no longer truly changed. To follow them was to follow life itself. When the moment came, it came with silence. There were no shouts, no chaos, only stillness. A collective breath held by both hunter and hunted. The air trembled with anticipation, every heartbeat echoing against the frost. Then, in a blur of motion, the ritual began. Flint-tipped spears arced through the air, guided by strength and ancient instinct. The impact was thunder in miniature, the culmination of days of tracking, studying, and waiting. The snow drank red, and steam rose from the fallen giants, mingling with the cold mist of morning. Yet within this moment of triumph was no joy, only gratitude. For the Neanderthals, every kill was sacred, a renewal of a covenant with the world that sustained them. Nothing was wasted. The hide became shelter, the bones tools and weapons, the tendons sinew for new spears. Even the fire that cooked the meat was seen as part of the same cycle, a gift returned to the gods of frost. Around that fire, in the glow of victory and necessity, the hunters sat not as conquerors, but as participants in a delicate balance older than memory itself. The hunt shaped their minds as much as their muscles. It required patience, planning, and communication. In the precision of a thrown spear and the coordination of a group, we find the roots of human cooperation. Each hunt was a story retold in gestures and echoes, passed to the next generation as both survival lesson and moral law. In this world of ice and hunger, reverence became the foundation of existence. The Neanderthals understood what later ages would forget, that to take life was also to honor it. Beneath frozen suns, they became more than hunters. They became keepers of balance, guardians of the fragile thread that bound earth, sky, and spirit together. Their world was cold, their days brutal. But through the hunt, they spoke the oldest language of all gratitude, written in the snow, blood, and breath of the living earth. Night came softly upon the Ice Age plains, spreading a vast blue shadow across the frozen earth. The world lay hushed beneath its blanket of cold, every sound softened by the snow, every movement slowed by the weight of winter. And then, as the stars began to pierce the darkness, the heavens came alive. From horizon to horizon, bands of green and violet light unfurled, weaving and dancing across the sky. Curtains of color rippled above the tundra, shimmering like breath upon glass. The aurora had awakened. It was not a thing to be merely seen, it was to be felt. The very air seemed to hum with invisible energy, a silent song echoing through the stillness of the frozen world. For the Neanderthals, this spectacle was no accident of nature. It was presence, a sign from beyond the reach of the living. The lights became their sky-born storytellers, the pathway of souls who had left the earth but not the memory of it. Each flicker, across the heavens, was an ancestor's spirit returning, walking once more above the snows they had once trod. To gaze upon the aurora was to look into eternity itself. Science now knows what they could not. Charged particles from the sun colliding with the atmosphere, setting the sky ablaze in electromagnetic fire. But beneath that knowledge lies a deeper truth, the emotional gravity of wonder. The same awe that electrified their senses still echoes within us. In those ancient nights, the Neanderthals watched the aurora as both miracle and message. It gave them hope that even in death, the fire of life endured somewhere above the clouds. The glow of the lights mirrored the flicker of their campfires below. Earth and sky seemed to speak the same language, light in darkness, warmth amid cold. Perhaps, In those quiet moments, they sensed a connection between the flames they kept and the ones dancing overhead. One sustained their bodies, the other, their spirits. The aurora became myth long before words could hold it. It was the first bridge between heaven and earth, a cosmic reminder that life was never truly alone beneath the stars. As the wind whispered through the endless snow, the lights continued to move, patient and eternal, guardians of a fragile world learning to dream. And in that shimmering sky, the Neanderthals saw not just beauty, but belonging, a sign that even in the coldest night, the universe remembered them. The world began to empty itself. Where once the plains trembled beneath herds of mammoth and bison, there came only stillness. The great beasts that had roamed the tundra for countless generations began to vanish, one by one, their tracks fading beneath drifts of unbroken snow. The forests, too, retreated, skeletal remains of trees standing against the wind like ancient sentinels waiting for spring that would never come. The air grew thinner, colder, quieter, and in that stillness, life itself seemed to pause. For the Neanderthals, this was more than a season of scarcity. It was a transformation of the world's very soul. The rivers froze deeper each year, trapping fish beneath black ice. The caribou no longer returned to their familiar valleys. Birds fell silent. The skies, once alive with the green whispers of the aurora, now hung dull and heavy, veiled by endless snow. The balance that had guided their ancestors for millennia had shifted, and no one could say why. In this great silence, fear took on the weight of faith. The clans began to speak of abandonment. They said the gods of fire had turned away, retreating to the heavens they once descended from. Perhaps the lights that once danced across the sky were no longer a blessing, but a memory of something that had ended. Even the sound of the wind changed, no longer a voice, but a warning. The cold had become its own master, a living thing that fed on warmth and hope alike. Yet even as the world seemed to crumble, the Neanderthals endured. They adapted not through conquest, but through patience. They learned to move differently, to hunt smaller prey, to gather roots buried beneath the frost. Theirs was not the cry of defiance, but the quiet rhythm of endurance, the instinct to wait out the storm. In this patience lay the deepest form of intelligence, the wisdom to bend rather than break. The great silence became a teacher. It stripped away excess, leaving only what was essential: fire, family, memory. Around the dim glow of their hearths, the Neanderthals began to tell stories not of victory, but of survival. They spoke of a time when the gods would return, when the sun would breathe again, and the rivers would sing. For now, the ice ruled the earth. It shaped the land, tested the living, and buried the past. But beneath that frozen surface, something waited, a spark not even the cold could extinguish. In the heart of silence, the story of resilience continued to whisper, reminding the world that even under the weight of endless winter, life would one day rise again. Long before written words or temples of stone, there existed a moment when memory itself became prophecy. The world was still gripped by cold, the tundra stretching endlessly beneath a gray sky that never fully brightened. The Neanderthals had endured famine and frost, yet something unseen was beginning to stir in their imagination. The boundaries between the living and the divine were thin, and in that fragile space, a new kind of vision began to take form. Among one of the small surviving bands, a young woman began to dream. Her nights were not of sleep, but of revelation. In her mind, she saw the sky tearing open, rivers boiling, and mountains breathing flame. She saw light not born of the sun but descending from the heavens itself, fire with a voice. The elders, hardened by hunger and silence, saw her as lost to madness. But her dreams would not fade. They grew sharper, louder, until even the animals seemed restless under her gaze. The land, too, began to change. The wind carried a strange scent, not of snow or soil, but of metal and dust. Birds took to the sky in wild flocks, vanishing toward the horizon. And then one evening, as the sun sank behind the ice, the heavens answered. A streak of light tore across the firmament, white and molten, splitting the clouds in two. The comet came like a god's hand, igniting the night and turning the snowfields gold. The world trembled, and the air was filled with the deep hum of the universe remembering its own creation. In that moment, awe replaced doubt. The visions were not delusion, but remembrance, echoes of a connection older than speech. The Neanderthals had always looked to the earth for survival. But now they looked to the sky and saw something greater. To them, the fire that fell from the heavens was not destruction. It was renewal. The cold, relentless grip of winter met its rival. From that night forward, fire became divine. It was no longer just warmth or weapon, but a message. The woman who had dreamed of it became legend, a bridge between worlds, the first to hear the gods whisper through flame. And as the comet faded into the distance, leaving the night heavy with silence and wonder, a truth took root among her people. That salvation did not come from strength or numbers, but from listening. The sky had spoken, and through her dreams, humanity had learned to answer. The world had waited in silence, and then, without warning, the sky began to fall. From the stillness of the upper air came light so fierce it turned night into day. The heavens erupted in waves of fire. Across the northern plains, fragments of flame rained down, tearing through clouds and ice alike. The air itself seemed to ignite. The frozen tundra, untouched for centuries, began to melt beneath the fury of the stars. What followed was chaos written in elements. The ground shook as if the earth were trying to awaken from a deep and painful dream. Mountains groaned, rivers boiled, and entire forests of ice collapsed into thunderous floods. The glaciers that had stood unbroken for ages cracked like glass, releasing torrents that carved new valleys in their path. The sound of rushing water drowned the wind. Across the white world, the roar of creation and destruction mingled until nothing else could be heard. To the Neanderthals who watched from their caves and cliffs, this was not catastrophe. It was revelation. The dreams of the shaman had come to life. The gods had returned, not as figures of mercy, but as forces of balance. Fire, the great purifier, was undoing the dominion of the cold. The same heavens that had once condemned them to darkness now offered the promise of renewal. As the weeks passed, the land transformed. Where glaciers had ruled, rivers began to run again. Moss and grass crept across thawing plains. The animals that had fled the frozen world began to return, cautious at first, then in growing numbers. Warmth, fragile but real, spread across the wounded earth. Life was stirring once more. Yet this rebirth carried its own cost. Many perished in the floods and falling fires. Entire clans vanished, their shelters swept away by rivers that had never existed before. But in their passing, the world itself was reborn. The cold loosened its grip, and the eternal winter began to die. The balance between death and renewal had been restored by forces older than understanding. In the quiet after the storm, the survivors stood beneath a sky forever changed. The air smelled different, sharp with minerals, alive with possibility. The memory of fire lingered in the soil, in the stones, in the hearts of those who had witnessed the heavens fall. They would carry that memory forward as story, as reverence, as warning, for they had seen the truth of their existence, that creation and destruction are never separate, that life endures only because the universe itself is willing to burn and begin again. The shaman's dream had not merely come true, it had become the foundation of a new world. In the aftermath of the falling heavens, the world was reshaped. The old ice, broken and retreating, gave way to a wounded earth, still trembling from its awakening. Across the northern plains, the survivors moved like shadows through steam and fog, drawn toward a place where the sky still breathed smoke. It was there, along the jagged ridges of blackened rock, that they found warmth. To them, these burning mountains were not mere geography. They were alive, the dwelling place of gods who had descended through fire. The volcanoes rose from the horizon like colossal altars, their peaks crowned in plumes of ash that painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The air shimmered with heat, and beneath their feet, the ground pulsed faintly, as if a great heart beat deep below. To the Neanderthals who had endured the endless winter, this place was both terrifying and divine. Here, the frost could not conquer. The rivers that ran from the mountain's flank were warm to the touch. The soil was dark and fertile, heavy with the scent of minerals. In this land of smoke and heat, the survivors built their new world. They carved shelters into the volcanic rock, shaping stone walls that could withstand both flame and storm. Inside, the walls came alive with symbols, spirals, serpents, and circles of fire. These were not decorations. They were prayers etched into the living bones of the earth. Each figure represented the covenant between the people and the mountain, a reminder that the gods' breath still lingered beneath them. The ash that settled from the sky was gathered and mixed with blood to create pigments, deep reds and blacks that mirrored the colors of the eruptions above. Here, myth became architecture. The smoke that rose from the craters was seen as the exhalation of divine beings, the same forces that had brought warmth back to the frozen world. When the mountain rumbled, they believed it was the voice of the gods remembering their creation. To live near such power was a risk, yet to live without it meant returning to the cold emptiness that had nearly erased them. And so they stayed, bound by awe and necessity. The animals that roamed these new lands were different. Herds gathered where the earth was warmest, and the people learned to follow them, to read the subtle patterns of life renewed. Around the fires, stories began to take form, stories of a great awakening, of fire that fell from the sky, of a mountain that breathed life back into the world. These stories were not entertainment. They were maps of meaning, guiding the next generation through memory and myth alike. From the heat of these volcanic plains came transformation. The stone hardened into tools sharper than before. The ash nourished roots that clung to life in the cracks of rock, and the people themselves grew wiser, more attuned to the rhythms of the living earth. They had walked through extinction and found sanctuary in the heart of fire. As night fell over the glowing ridges, the heavens shimmered once more, not with terror, but with light reflected from the molten rivers below. The Neanderthals looked up and saw the stars flicker above the smoke, as if echoing the embers beneath their feet. The gods of the smoke mountain had not only given them warmth, they had given them memory, a connection between heaven and earth, fire and flesh, life and death. And from that sacred bond, humanity's oldest faith was born. The belief that even in destruction, creation waits, and that in the breath of the gods lies the endurance of all that lives. Beneath the mountains where smoke still curled toward the heavens, the Neanderthals discovered another world, one untouched by wind or fire. It was a world of stillness, of dripping stone and perpetual twilight. The caves stretched deep into the earth, their walls glistening with moisture, their air heavy with the scent of minerals and ancient water. To step inside was to step out of time itself. Here, beneath the trembling crust of the living earth, they found a place where the world above could not reach, a place where memory could be preserved. The Neanderthals began to carve. With stone tools sharpened by patience and reverence, they etched faces into the walls, lions with knowing eyes, bulls with horns that curved like the crescent moon, eagles frozen in mid-flight. These were not mere depictions of the hunt or the wilderness. They were invocations, embodiments of something greater. To them, the animals were not just creatures, they were messengers of the divine, guardians of balance between life and death, warmth and cold, earth and sky. Each carving held a fragment of worship and memory. The people who shaped them were not recording events but translating belief into form. The flicker of torchlight against the rough walls made the faces seem alive, shifting and breathing with every movement. In those dim chambers, the Neanderthals spoke to their gods, not with words but with creation itself. To carve was to remember, to touch the sacred. These caves became sanctuaries of identity. In a world ruled by ice and uncertainty, the walls offered permanence. The earth itself became the canvas of faith. Traces of ochre and charcoal still cling to those walls tens of thousands of years later, a testament to their vision to the idea that the divine could be summoned not from the heavens alone but from the stone beneath their feet. The gods were not distant rulers in the sky. They lived within the earth, breathing through rock and fire, watching through the eyes of beasts. The act of carving transformed them as much as it transformed the cave. It demanded observation, imagination, patience, qualities that mirrored the very essence of survival. In shaping the world around them, they shaped themselves. The lines of the carvings echoed the same rhythm as the wind across the tundra and the pulse of the molten earth below. The cave walls became mirrors of existence, capturing both the fragility of their lives and the eternal nature of the forces they revered. As the centuries passed, the sacred caves became places of gathering, mourning, and renewal. When the cold tightened its grip, when famine came, when the fire outside dimmed, they returned to the stone. They touched the faces they had carved, seeking strength in the stillness. To them, the stone did not merely hold images, it held spirit, memory, and connection to the unseen. Even as their kind began to fade, these carvings endured. They would outlast the hands that shaped them, surviving millennia of silence. Long after the last Neanderthal voice faded into the wind, the spirits beneath the stone remained eternal witnesses to the first human understanding that the sacred was not something to be sought above, but something already alive within the earth itself. Through those carvings, they whispered the oldest truth of all, that creation is remembrance, and remembrance is survival. The air above the smoking mountains had begun to settle, and with it came the burden of meaning. The survivors of fire and ice, those who had endured the fury of the heavens and the silence of the cold, began to understand that existence itself was no longer enough. To live without remembrance was to vanish like breath in the wind. And so, in the dawn of a newly warming world, a covenant was born, not of wealth or conquest, but of memory. The Neanderthals had always been creatures of the earth. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons, the migrations of herds, the flicker of the stars. But after the fires, after the long winter that nearly erased them, they began to see time differently. Life was no longer a simple circle of birth and death. It had become a story, one that demanded to be told, again and again. The shaman, keeper of dreams and interpreter of signs, became the voice of this revelation. She taught that the gods did not hunger for offerings of blood or gold. They desired remembrance. Every hunt, every birth, every passing soul had to be honored, spoken aloud, preserved in ash and bone. The people began to weave this belief into the fabric of their daily lives. When a child was born, a mark was placed upon a stone with red ochre, symbolizing the spark of fire returned to the world. When the hunt was successful, the bones of the fallen beast were arranged in sacred patterns beside the hearth, a gesture of gratitude to the forces that had allowed life to continue. And when one of their own died, their remains were buried with care, surrounded by the tools they had used and the pigments they had loved, their story whispered into the earth so it would not be forgotten. Ash became sacred. It carried the essence of fire, the breath of the gods that had melted the world free from its prison of ice. The shaman mixed it with water and blood, using it to draw symbols upon the stones, each line a record of what must never fade. Bone, too, became a vessel of remembrance, carved, painted, preserved. In these small acts of devotion, the Neanderthals created the first archives of the human soul. To remember was to resist the cold. They believed that forgetting invited darkness, that if their stories were lost, the ice would return to reclaim the world. Memory itself became a shield against extinction, a spiritual fire that burned even when the hearths went dark. The gods had given them survival through knowledge. Now it was their duty to protect that gift through story. In time, the rituals deepened. Songs emerged low, rhythmic chants that echoed through the caves like heartbeat and thunder. The cadence of these prayers carried the names of ancestors, the cries of hunts, the murmurs of birth. Around every fire, stories were spoken into the smoke, rising upward to join the breath of the mountains. It was said that as long as the smoke carried their words, the gods would hear and keep the cold at bay. The covenant of ash and bone became the foundation of their being, a sacred pact between memory and survival. Through it, they transformed from mere witnesses of nature into participants in its eternal cycle. They understood that immortality did not live in flesh or flame, but in remembrance, the act of carrying forward what must never be lost. And so, as the night stretched across the earth and the stars glowed like embers in the sky, the Neanderthals kept their promise. Around every fire, they remembered. Through every birth, they honored. With every death, they gave thanks. The ice had tested them. The fire had changed them. But memory had saved them. Generations passed, and the age of storms began to fade into memory. The world, once locked beneath endless winter, was changing. Valleys that had been buried beneath ice now glimmered with rivers again. Grass grew in places that had known only frost. The herds returned to the plains, and with them came the slow rhythm of life restored. Yet for those who remembered the great cold, the fire that had saved them was more than warmth, it was inheritance. It was the heart of all that remained sacred. The clans who had survived the cataclysms of the past now faced a choice. Some looked toward the distant south, where the air was softer and the land generous. They believed the gods had given them a chance to begin anew, far from the shadow of the mountains that still breathed smoke. Others stayed behind, unwilling to abandon the place where the fire first touched the earth. They called themselves the carriers, the keepers of the gods' first light. To the carriers, fire was not simply a tool, but a living being, a bridge between the heavens and the soil. It was the spark that had freed the world from the prison of ice, the proof that divinity had once walked among them. They guarded it in stone vessels lined with ash, feeding it each day with resin and bark, whispering prayers as the flames shifted and sighed. Children were taught from birth that their lives were bound to the flame's survival. To let it die was to let the gods vanish again into silence. Their existence became one of ritual and vigilance. The fire never slept. Even in the deep of night, when the stars trembled in the cold air, someone was always awake, tending its glow. The light of the flame touched everything they did. It burned during births, flickered beside the dying, and traveled with them when they hunted or moved across the plains. The smoke rising from their hearths was a signal to the heavens, a promise that the covenant of memory still held. Those who left to seek warmth in distant lands carried the fire with them too, though in smaller forms. They took glowing embers sealed in clay and wrapped in moss, preserving them through long journeys. Wherever they stopped, they rekindled the flame and built a new circle of stones around it. Across continents and generations, the light spread. Each new settlement became an echo of the first mountain fire, a continuation of a single breath that had begun when the gods descended through the sky. Through this tradition, the Neanderthals transformed fire from a chance discovery into a legacy. It was their scripture, written not in words, but in light. The carriers held its meaning as law that to live was to protect what had once saved them. Around each flame, the stories were retold. How the heavens had burned, how the ice had receded, how the gods had given them warmth so they might endure. As the years deepened into centuries, the carriers became wanderers of faith, moving wherever the earth still whispered with heat. Some vanished into the southern forests, their fires dimming in the mist of time. Others remained by the volcanic lands, guardians of the eternal ember. To them, the world was no longer divided by ice and warmth, but by memory and forgetting. And though their names have faded into the long silence of prehistory, their legacy did not. The fire they protected never truly died. It lives in every flame that still burns, in every hearth that glows against the dark. Through their devotion, the light of the gods became the light of humanity itself, a promise carried from age to age, from ash to life, from the first dawn to the last. The world had grown softer by degrees, but it still remembered the fury of its birth. The earth steamed in places where fire once poured from its veins, and the rivers still carved through the bones of melted ice. Above this shifting land, the sky ruled with a temper of its own. Clouds gathered in dark armies, rolling across the horizon like living mountains. Then, without warning, the silence would break. A single flash tore through the heavens, followed by a roar that seemed to shake the very soul of the world. To the Neanderthals, it was not mere weather. It was language. They called it the voice of the gods, a reminder that the forces which shaped the land still watched from above. Thunder, to them, was not noise but message. The sound came from nowhere yet filled everything, echoing through valleys, bouncing off cliffs, resonating in the chest of every living creature. It was the same sound, they believed, that had awakened the world when the heavens first fell, the same voice that had summoned fire from the sky and freed the earth from its long, frozen sleep. In that voice, they heard rhythm and intention. The elders taught that thunder had meaning, that its cadence was a kind of divine pulse. Short, sharp cracks were signs of warning. Long, rolling booms carried messages of blessing or remembrance. They would stand in the open plains and listen, counting the intervals between lightning and sound, their hearts steadying to its beat. In the voice of the sky, they found both awe and comfort, a reassurance that the gods had not abandoned them, only changed their form. For a people whose world was ruled by natural law, thunder became their scripture. They began to mimic its rhythm in their rituals. The striking of stones, the beating of drums made from stretched hide, the pounding of feet in ceremonial circles, all became echoes of the sky's speech. Each rumble of the storm was interpreted as conversation, each bolt of lightning as divine punctuation in the ongoing dialogue between heaven and earth. The children learned this reverence from their earliest days. When storms gathered, they were taught to remain still, to listen rather than fear. Their elders said the gods spoke loudest when the world trembled. The flash of lightning illuminated more than the sky. It revealed the connection between all things: earth, fire, air, and life itself. In those moments, the boundary between the mortal and the divine seemed to dissolve. The storms also shaped their understanding of power. The carriers of fire had seen the gods' warmth in flame. Now their descendants saw their strength in sound. They understood that creation was not always gentle, that even the most violent forces could be sacred. To live under a sky that spoke was to live in constant dialogue with mystery. And so, thunder became prayer. When the storms raged across the plains, the Neanderthals raised their faces to the rain, feeling its cold sting as a baptism of remembrance. The elders whispered that the gods were not gone. They had merely moved upward into the clouds, speaking now in light and sound rather than fire and ash. Long after the storms passed, the memory of their voices lingered. The air would taste of iron and ozone, and the people would breathe it in like incense. In the hush that followed, they felt a presence in the stillness, the echo of words too vast to be understood, yet too familiar to be forgotten. The gods, they believed, were still speaking. All that was required was to listen. The world was thawing. Slowly, then suddenly, the great ice sheets that had gripped the continents for generations began to release their hold. Mountains long buried in white re-emerged as black stone. Rivers once locked in silence began to move again, winding through the valleys like veins carrying the pulse of a reborn earth. The sun grew stronger, its warmth returning to places that had forgotten its touch. For the first time in millennia, color returned to the land. Moss spread across rocks that had never known green, and wildflowers broke through soil still damp from ages of frost. But with the gift of warmth came chaos. The melting world did not awaken quietly. As glaciers retreated, they released the weight of entire ages, and the land groaned beneath the change. Rivers swelled into torrents, carving new paths where none had existed. Whole forests were uprooted and swept away. The low plains that had once been home to mammoth herds became vast inland seas. The wind carried the sound of rushing water across the horizon, an endless chorus of creation and destruction entwined. For the Neanderthals, the fire carriers of the north, it was a time of awe and sorrow. From the cliffs above the rising floods, they watched the world they had known dissolve before their eyes. The plains where their ancestors had hunted, the caves that had held their memories, and the stones where their fires once burned, all began to vanish beneath the surging meltwater. It was as though the earth itself was washing away its past. What remained was uncertain, raw, and new. The people climbed higher, carrying their sacred flames in stone vessels, shielding them from the wind and the rain. The fire that had once saved them from the cold now flickered weakly in the damp air, threatened by the very warmth that had brought the world back to life. They saw beauty in the rivers and terror in their power. The gods, it seemed, had traded one trial for another. The ice had tested endurance. The floods would test faith. The melting changed more than the landscape. It altered the rhythm of existence. The herds moved north, chasing the edge of the retreating glaciers. Fish returned to the rivers, and birds filled the skies with sound, yet food was never certain. Where there had once been stability and cold, now there was movement and unpredictability. The fire carriers adapted, learning to follow the changing waters, to build shelters on higher ground, to read the shifting signs of the new season. But in every moment of adaptation lay a shadow of loss. The people carried with them not only their fire, but the weight of remembrance. They whispered the names of drowned valleys and buried caves, speaking to ghosts swallowed by water. To them, every flood was both an ending and a promise that life, like fire, could not be contained forever. The gods had melted the world, perhaps not to destroy it, but to reshape it, to remind creation that nothing was meant to remain still. As the last sheets of ice dissolved into mist, the world began to breathe again. The air grew heavy with moisture and the scent of soil. The sun glowed red against the wet horizon, reflecting on rivers that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. The fire carriers stood upon the cliffs, their flames trembling against the wind, and watched the birth of a new earth. Below them, their memories sank beneath the rising waters, carried away to places they could no longer reach. Yet, in their hearts, they knew the truth, written by generations before them, that the end of one world is never the end of the story. As the waters rose, they held their fire high, and in its fragile light, the promise of survival burned on. The melting of the world did not bring salvation for all. As the rivers swelled and the glaciers withdrew into memory, life itself fractured into new paths. Some peoples followed the warmth, chasing the sun into greener lands, while others lingered among the fading snows, unwilling or unable to leave the places that had defined them. The earth was shifting, reshaping its boundaries, and in that transformation, entire tribes vanished. The great floodplains of the north became graveyards of memory. Beneath the water and mud, villages disappeared, their hearths extinguished, their fire stones scattered. The bones of hunters, the tools of artisans, the pigments of artists were swallowed by silt. In the deep layers of soil that once held their footprints, time began its quiet work of erasure. What remained were traces, a carved flint here, a handprint pressed into ochre there, faint gestures of lives that had burned brightly and been forgotten by all but the wind. The Neanderthals who survived carried the silence of those who did not. The fire carriers told stories of the lost tribes, their voices low and reverent, their words woven into the smoke that rose from their campfires. They said the gods had not abandoned their kin but had taken them back, returned them to the frozen heavens from which fire once fell. To them, every disappearance was not tragedy but fulfillment, the closing of a circle that began when the sky first burned. But beneath this faith lay grief. The fire carriers wandered through lands, once thick with life, and found only echoes. The songs of the herds had vanished. The caves that once rang with laughter now held only dripping water and dust. Sometimes they would find the remains of others' tools frozen in mud, bones arranged in careful burial, marks that spoke of reverence even in despair. In those quiet discoveries, they recognized kinship across time, a shared struggle carved into the fabric of the earth. The floods had reshaped not only the land, but the balance of existence. The animals they had hunted grew scarce, forced to follow new paths. Forests spread where tundra once ruled, and the rhythms of survival changed. Those who adapted endured. Those who could not were reclaimed by the ice or the sea. The gods, it seemed, were choosing which parts of their creation would continue and which would return to silence. In later generations, stories of the lost tribes became myth. The fire carriers spoke of voices that lingered in the fog, of songs heard in the wind over frozen lakes, of shadows moving across the moonlit snow. They believed the spirits of the vanished still walked beside them, unseen but present, guiding them away from danger, reminding them to keep the flame alive. Every thunderstorm was their whisper. Every flicker of the aurora was their remembrance. And yet, even as the Neanderthals honored their memory, they knew they too walked a narrow path between survival and disappearance. The world was changing faster than their bodies or minds could follow. The gods who had once given them warmth were now testing their endurance once more, not with ice or famine, but with the relentless turning of time. Across the plains, the wind carried the last traces of a people who had once ruled the cold. Their handprints remained on cave walls like signatures of defiance against extinction, silent declarations that they had existed, that they had endured. The gods may have taken many back, but the earth itself refused to forget them. Beneath layers of stone and soil, the lost tribes of the ice still slept, waiting for the day their story would be remembered again, not as a tale of disappearance, but as proof that even in loss, humanity endures. Long after the floods receded and the ice surrendered its final hold on the world, something new appeared upon the open plains, something that did not belong to Earth. It came in silence, cutting across the night sky like a wound of fire, a streak of light so bright that it cast shadows upon the sleeping ground. When it fell, the heavens themselves seemed to shatter. The following day, where the fire had struck, the air was heavy with the scent of iron and smoke. The people who approached the place of impact did not find ash or ruin alone. They found a gift. Lying at the center of a circle of scorched stone was a fragment unlike anything they had ever seen. It was small, dense, and heavy beyond measure. Its surface blackened, but glinting faintly with a light that seemed to come from within. The shard was smooth in some places, sharp in others, as if shaped by forces greater than any hand. To the Neanderthals, it was unmistakable, a piece of the sky itself, torn from the body of the gods and delivered to the earth. They called it the Stone of Heaven. The shaman, guardian of fire and memory, declared it sacred. This was no ordinary rock. It was born of the same light that had once saved them from the cold. the same fire that had melted the ice and awakened the rivers. The people gathered around it in reverent silence, their breath rising like smoke into the still air. They believed the gods had sent it as a sign, a reminder that even as worlds changed, the bond between heaven and earth remained unbroken. In time, they learned to shape it. With patience and ritual, they struck it with hammerstones, chipping away the rough edges until it revealed a dark, metallic heart. When polished, it gleamed with an otherworldly brilliance, a light unlike any known material. They crafted it into a talisman, worn upon the chest of the shaman during rituals of fire and remembrance. It became the axis of their world, a symbol of endurance forged not in the earth's depths, but in the vastness of the sky. The stone was believed to hold power not of destruction, but of continuity. Its presence was said to steady the spirit and strengthen the heart. When storms rolled across the plains and thunder echoed through the valleys, the people would hold it toward the sky, as if returning its gaze to the heavens from which it had fallen. It was both relic and bridge, a piece of eternity that could be touched. Through this single fragment, the Neanderthals began to perceive a deeper truth about their place in the cosmos. They were not merely inhabitants of the earth. They were participants in a grander cycle that reached beyond the clouds and stars. The same forces that had shaped stone and river had now placed a piece of the heavens in their hands. In that connection, they found reassurance that the gods had not abandoned them, but continued to speak in the language of flame and iron. Generations passed, and the story of the sky's gift became legend. The stone was kept safe, guarded through famine, storm, and migration. It was touched by countless hands, each believing it held within it the memory of light before the world's rebirth. Even as the people changed, even as their numbers dwindled and new faces appeared across the land, the stone endured. Long after its makers were gone, it would remain buried in the soil, its metallic gleam untouched by time. Archaeologists, thousands of centuries later, would one day find such meteoritic fragments in ancient sites, remnants of cosmic fire that fell during the Ice Age. They would study them as relics of celestial history. But for the Neanderthals, who first held that shimmering piece of the sky, it was something far greater proof that the universe remembered them, that the fire of life did not end on Earth but continued to fall from the stars. It was, and would forever be, the gods' reminder that endurance is its own kind of divinity. When the world began to breathe again, the silence of the Ice Age gave way to the murmur of words. The earth was no longer only a place of survival, it had become a canvas of memory. The rivers ran louder, forests stretched toward the sky, and the air carried the sounds of language taking shape. It began not as speech but as rhythm, the steady beat of footsteps, the crackle of fire, the low hum of wind through the trees. From these sounds, meaning emerged. From meaning, story was born. The Neanderthals who had endured the darkness of the cold carried within them a deep well of remembrance. Their lives were no longer merely about the hunt or the fire's warmth. They had lived through cataclysm and awakening, and they knew that such experiences could not be allowed to fade. The shaman, who once spoke to the gods through dreams and flame, now spoke through words, weaving memory into sound so that the past might survive the passing of generations. Every story began with the fire. Around its glow, faces flickered in the light as the storyteller spoke of the gods who had descended through the heavens when the sky burned. Children listened with wide eyes as the tale of the fire from above became a sacred origin, how the gods had melted the ice, how their gift of flame had given the world a second birth. These myths were more than entertainment. They were lessons, disguised as wonder, shaping the moral and spiritual fabric of those who listened. Through them, knowledge became memory, and memory became faith. In those early stories, time itself took on new meaning. The people learned to see the world not just as a series of seasons, but as a vast continuum, a living memory stretching from the ancestors of the ice to the descendants of the fire. The telling of stories became a ceremony of connection. It bound the living to the dead, the hunters to the mountains, the children to the stars. The words carried not only fact but feeling, ensuring that every moment of triumph, loss, or revelation was given a place in eternity. The rhythm of storytelling soon found its form in art. The same hands that carved the spirits into stone began to trace symbols in the dust, lines and spirals that echoed the cadence of spoken myths. Each image was a word turned to shape, a piece of sound made visible. The caves that once served as sanctuaries of worship now became libraries of memory, filled with colors drawn from the earth itself. In red and black pigments, the people painted their gods, their hunts, their dreams, a language without letters that spoke directly to the soul. Through story, the Neanderthals achieved something no tool or weapon could grant them: continuity. Words allowed them to live beyond their bodies, to speak across time. When a child repeated the stories of the gods of fire or the ancestors who hunted under the aurora, that child became both teller and vessel. The act of remembering became sacred. To forget was to risk losing not only history but identity. And so, as the earth warmed and the generations passed, stories multiplied like rivers after the thaw. They flowed across valleys, carried in song, in carvings, in the rhythm of drums echoing the heartbeat of the storms above. In those tales, the people found the measure of their place within the cosmos, small but enduring, fragile yet eternal. The birth of story marked the beginning of humanity's greatest inheritance. Through words, the Neanderthals reached beyond survival. They reached for meaning. They transformed memory into myth, and myth into legacy. And though their voices have long since faded into the earth, the pulse of their stories still beats in every spark of imagination that followed the endless echo of a fire that first taught us to speak. Deep in the heart of the mountains, beyond the reach of wind and sunlight, there exists a silence older than language. Within that silence, the walls of a hidden cavern breathe with color, a mosaic of crimson hands pressed against stone tens of thousands of years ago. To step into this space is to enter a conversation with eternity. The air hangs thick with the scent of mineral dust and ancient fire, and the dim flicker of torchlight brings the painted palms to life. It is here, in this cathedral of stone, that the first great declaration of humanity was made. We lived. The cave of the red handprint stands as both shrine and testimony. For the Neanderthals, who had survived fire, ice, and the reshaping of the earth, this place was not a mere shelter. It was sacred ground, a bridge between the world of the living and the spirits that watched from beyond. The ochre pigment, ground from earth rich in iron and mixed with saliva, fat, and ash, became their ink of remembrance. Each hand pressed upon the rock was more than art, it was identity, proof of existence in a world that so easily erased it. The act itself was ritual. They would blow pigment from hollow reeds or smear it directly onto the wall, leaving behind the silhouette of their own hand, a personal mark within the shared memory of their people. Over generations, the prints multiplied, overlapping and intertwining like a chorus of voices singing through time. The hands were of men and women, elders and children alike. Each one spoke the same message: we remember, and we endure. To the Neanderthals, these markings were not mere decoration but invocation. The walls became a living skin, the red pigment a symbol of blood and fire, the essence of life. The gods, once believed to dwell only in the sky or the mountains, were now seen as living through those who survived. The divine was no longer distant, it had taken residence in human touch. By leaving their mark, they were not worshipping the gods from afar. They were becoming part of them, merging spirit with stone. The echoes of their breath still linger in these chambers. Archaeologists, tens of millennia later, would find these prints and marvel at their simplicity. Yet within that simplicity lies the foundation of culture. This was the moment when Neanderthal humanity transcended mere survival. In claiming their place upon the walls, they claimed their place within time itself. The hand was both tool and symbol, capable of shaping stone and shaping meaning. Through it, the first artists, philosophers, and dreamers emerged. The red handprints were also promises. Each one carried the weight of generations past and the hope of those yet to come. When they pressed their palms to the cold walls, they sealed an unspoken covenant that life, though fragile, would not be forgotten. Even as ice reclaimed the valleys and species vanished into the earth, the memory of their fire would remain, glowing faintly in the pigment that refused to fade. Standing in that cave today, one can still feel the presence of those ancient souls. The ochre hands stretch outward, not as relics, but as reminders that even in the harshest age, beauty found a way to exist. The cave of the red handprints is not only an artifact of prehistory, it is a testament to consciousness itself, to the moment when beings of flesh and breath first realized that to live was not enough. One must leave a trace. One must say to the universe, however briefly, I was here. And so, the walls continue to whisper their ancient truth, carried across millennia by the language of color and touch. We lived. We remembered. And through remembrance, we became something eternal. The warmth that had once returned began to falter. The skies dimmed, and a strange stillness crept over the land. The winds that had softened now grew sharp again, and the rivers, newly awakened from their icy prisons, began to freeze once more. It was as if the earth, weary from rebirth, had paused to draw a final, cold breath. The fire carriers, descendants of those who had once worshipped the burning mountains, recognized the signs. The gods, they believed, were testing them again. The world was entering its last great winter. This new age of cold was not as vast as the one that had come before, but it carried a deeper cruelty. The seasons lost their rhythm. Summers became brief and uncertain. Winters arrived without warning and refused to leave. The animals, which had returned in abundance, now grew lean and restless. The herds migrated erratically, their ancient patterns broken. The forests, still young and thin, withered beneath the frost. Even the sky seemed heavier, its light weaker, as though the sun itself were retreating from the world. For the Neanderthals who remained, survival was once again a sacred ritual. Fire was no longer a tool of comfort, it was existence itself. The fire carriers, those who had kept the flame alive through generations, passed down their final teaching. Keep the fire burning, for when it dies, so will we. The hearth became the center of the universe, the point around which all life revolved. Children learned before they could speak that the flame must never be left untended. Every spark, every ember, was a heartbeat of the gods. In caves and shelters across the frozen plains, the flicker of orange light became the last defiance against extinction. The people huddled around the flames, feeding them with the last of their wood, whispering prayers into the smoke that rose toward the ceiling. The air outside howled with the voice of a dying season, but inside, the warmth endured fragile, trembling, alive. The cold tested not only the body but the spirit. Hunger returned, as did sickness. Yet the fire carriers adapted with a quiet genius that had always defined their kind. They learned to hunt smaller prey, to trap, to preserve what little they could find. They built windbreaks of stone and bone, sealed their shelters with hides, and used ash to insulate the walls. But most of all, they remembered. Memory became the fuel of survival, the stories of the gods who fell as fire, the covenant of ash and bone, the promise of warmth that had carried them through countless trials. As the last winter deepened, some clans disappeared into the snow, their fires fading like distant stars. Others endured, moving south toward valleys where the earth still breathed warmth. They carried the embers of their hearths in stone bowls lined with clay, shielding them from wind and rain. To lose the flame was to lose their soul, and so they guarded it as the heart of existence itself. In time, the storms began to quiet. The air softened, and the ice withdrew once more, reluctant but defeated. Yet by then, the world had changed beyond recognition. The fire carriers, who had once spoken with the gods through thunder and flame, were few. Their voices had grown faint, their numbers dwindling into legend. But they had done what they were meant to do, they had kept the flame. Even as the last of their kind gazed into the embers and saw their reflection dance in the dying light, they knew that something of them would endure. The fire they protected had already spread beyond their hands, into new tribes, new generations. The gods' gift would not vanish with them. It would move forward, carried by those who would inherit the earth. The last winter did not erase them. It completed them. In their endurance, they had fulfilled the ancient promise that the light of the sky which once fell to earth would never be extinguished. It would burn in the hearts of all who came after. Eternal, unseen, but alive, the fire that outlived the cold. As the last winter receded into memory, the world carried scars of its long endurance. The glaciers, those ancient towers of silence, still loomed across the horizon like frozen monuments to time itself. Beneath their weight, valleys slumbered, rivers lay buried, and within the deep blue heart of the ice, legends whispered of something more. The Neanderthals spoke of beings not entirely human nor divine figures of light, entombed in crystal chambers far below the frozen earth. These were the sleeping gods, the guardians of the old world, waiting for the day the cold would release them once more. The stories told that before the first fire fell from the heavens, before the great floods and the rising forests, the gods had descended to the earth to walk among their creation. When the cold came, they did not abandon it. They sank into the depths, beneath the glaciers and mountains, encased in clear ice that shimmered with faint inner light. The shamanic elders called it the breath of the gods, trapped in crystal form. To gaze into a deep crevasse was to glimpse eternity itself, the faint glow of sleeping immortals, frozen in time yet still alive in spirit. In these myths, the ice was not merely a prison, it was a womb. The gods' slumber was part of a cycle, a rhythm between destruction and renewal. As long as the ice endured, the world would remain in balance. But when the time came for the great thaw, when the rivers began to flow again and the mountains cracked open under the weight of melting snow, the sleeping gods would awaken. Their return, it was said, would mark the turning of ages, a world transformed, not by fire this time, but by understanding. For the fire carriers and their descendants, the myth of the sleeping gods was both comfort and warning. It spoke to the fragile peace between humanity and nature, a covenant written not in words but in cycles of ice and flame. The people believed the gods beneath the glaciers still listened. When they offered their prayers in caves or burned offerings of resin and bone, the smoke rose to the heavens but also sank into the cracks of the earth, carried downward to the chambers of the sleeping divine. Science, thousands of generations later, would tell another version of the story. It would speak of microbes and seeds preserved in permafrost, of mammoths locked in perfect stillness, of ancient DNA waiting to be reawakened by warmth. Yet even that truth feels like an echo of the same idea that nothing in nature ever truly dies. It sleeps, waiting for its moment to return. The Neanderthals understood this intuitively. To them, the ice was memory. It held the past intact, protecting it from the corruption of time. The gods beneath the ice were a mirror of themselves, beings caught between worlds, suspended between extinction and endurance. In their slumber, the people saw a reflection of their own struggle to survive, to remain when everything around them changed. The cold had shaped them, tested them, but also preserved them, just as the glaciers preserved the Earth's forgotten wonders. As the centuries passed and the ice began its final retreat, the legend endured. The people would look upon the cracks in the melting glaciers and see light refracting through the ancient ice, shimmering like the eyes of something awakening. They would whisper that the gods were stirring, stretching after eons of rest, ready to breathe life into the new world that awaited. The gods who slept beneath the ice never truly needed to rise. Their power had already passed into the hands of those who carried fire, who remembered the old songs, who painted their hands upon cave walls, and taught their children to listen to the voice of the sky. Through humanity's endurance, the gods lived on not as figures of light trapped in crystal, but as the spark within every beating heart. The glaciers would one day vanish completely, the ice melting into rivers that fed new life. Yet the legend remained carved in the collective memory of the world, that the gods once slept beneath the ice, dreaming of the future, waiting for the day when their children would awaken in their place. The earth awakened slowly. What had once been a world of white and silence now shimmered with color and sound. The last glaciers, retreating giants of the Ice Age, collapsed into rivers that cut through stone and spread across the plains. Lakes formed where there had been valleys, and meadows replaced tundra. The cold that had ruled for ages loosened its grasp, giving way to a gentler rhythm, the sound of dripping water, the murmur of streams, the first breath of spring that seemed endless. It was the dawn of a new world. And for those who had endured the darkness, it must have felt like creation itself. For countless generations, the Neanderthals had known only struggle, the bitter hunt, the endless cold, the fragile glow of fire against a vast and uncaring night. Now, for the first time, they stepped into warmth that did not vanish with the setting sun. The air smelled different, thick with the scent of wet soil and blooming plants. The forests surged outward, reclaiming the land that ice had once devoured. Birch, pine, and willow rose where glaciers had stood immovable. Insects returned to the air. Birds filled the canopies, and the world became a living chorus. The people emerged cautiously from their stone shelters, blinking beneath a light that felt new, even though it was as old as time. They moved across fields that glowed with dew and found the earth soft beneath their feet. Streams that had once been frozen arteries of the land now flowed freely, clear and full of life. For the first time, they saw fish dart beneath the surface, their bodies flashing like shards of the gods' lost fire. It was as if the planet had exhaled after a long, terrible dream. To the Neanderthals, this renewal was no accident. It was the fulfillment of every myth they had carried through the cold. The gods who had once slept beneath the ice had awakened, and the warmth was their gift. The land was proof that the covenant of ash and bone had been kept. The fire carriers had not failed, they had endured, and through endurance, they had become part of the world's rebirth. Their fires still burned, but now the air itself seemed to hold warmth, as if the gods had given humanity permission to let the flame live within, rather than beside them. As they moved through this changing landscape, they rediscovered abundance. Herds returned to graze the plains. Rivers teemed with food. Where before they had scavenged and rationed, now they could gather freely. Yet with plenty came something new: reflection. The endless urgency of survival began to give way to wonder. They painted again upon the cave walls, but their images changed. Where once they had carved beasts of the hunt and symbols of struggle, they now depicted life flourishing, herds in motion, trees in bloom, fire burning not as desperation, but as celebration. The world they now inhabited pulsed with renewal, but beneath that beauty was something bittersweet. The old ways, the trials that had shaped them, were fading. The ice had been both enemy and teacher, forging their resilience, their reverence, their understanding of connection. Now, as the world softened, so too did the harsh lessons of their ancestors. The Neanderthals stood at the threshold of transformation, unaware that their time upon the earth was drawing to an end. Still, in that moment, they did not sense extinction. They felt only gratitude. As night fell over the newly thawed forests, They looked to the stars once veiled by smoke and snow, and whispered to the heavens in the language of memory. The light of the gods was still there, shimmering faintly, reflected in the rivers that wound across the land like veins of fire. The Neanderthals had witnessed the end of one world and the birth of another, and in doing so, they became part of both. The dawn over the melted world was not simply a new beginning for the earth. It was a quiet farewell. The people who had endured the frozen ages had carried humanity through the crucible of time. The gods had awakened, the fire had endured, and the ice had finally surrendered. The world was alive again, vast, green, and infinite, and for a brief, perfect moment, everything that had ever been fought for was made visible beneath the rising sun. The ice had withdrawn, but the world it left behind was not the same. The landscape had softened, reshaped by warmth and time, yet within its quiet beauty lay the memory of ages forged in hardship. The Neanderthals, those ancient heirs of the cold, now stood upon a transforming earth. The forests thickened, the rivers ran deeper, and life multiplied in ways unseen for millennia. But even as the world blossomed anew, change came to them as well, slow, inevitable, profound. They were no longer alone. Across the southern plains and river valleys, other tribes of early humans were spreading distant cousins who carried the same ancestral fire in their eyes. Their bodies were slighter, their tools finer, their numbers growing with the seasons. The Neanderthals watched these newcomers from afar, at first with caution, then with curiosity. In time, their paths began to cross at rivers, at hunting grounds, in the quiet places where the forests met the plains. What began as distance became contact. What began as contact became exchange. The fire that had once been the sole inheritance of the fire carriers now leapt from tribe to tribe. Not through conquest, but through curiosity. Ideas passed as silently as embers. How to shape stone with precision. How to trap warmth inside shelters of hide and bone. How to speak to one another, not with gestures alone, but with rhythm and tone. The Neanderthals taught as much as they learned, their strength and memory blending with the innovation and adaptability of others. From this meeting of worlds, something new was born, not a replacement, but a fusion. Over generations, bloodlines intertwined, traits shifted. The faces of the children began to change. The robust jaws softened, the foreheads lifted, the eyes retained their depth but gained new light. The gods' legacy was not vanishing. It was evolving. The fire carriers did not disappear into extinction, as myths might claim. They were absorbed into the great story of humanity itself, their endurance woven into the fabric of the species that would inherit the earth. Every breath of modern man still carries traces of that ancient fire. Every spark struck from stone, every flame kindled in the dark, is a continuation of their first covenant. Science, millennia later, would confirm what the myths had always whispered, that their blood did not vanish. It flows still, hidden within the genetic map of humanity, silent but indelible. In the marrow of our bones lies the echo of the ones who kept the flame alive through endless winters. In our hands, that same intelligence, that same instinct to create and remember, endures. The Neanderthals never truly left. They became part of us. The gods they once worshipped had given them fire, and they, in turn, gave that fire to the world. It was not in temples or monuments that their legacy was preserved, but in the breath of every living descendant who carried their spark forward. The story of survival they began became the story of humanity itself, the endless struggle between fragility and endurance, destruction and creation, forgetting and remembrance. As the sun rose over the green valleys of a warming earth, the last of the Neanderthals looked out upon the world they had shaped and protected. They could not have known that their time was ending. Yet in a deeper sense, it was not an ending at all. Their spirit had already passed into the hands of others, into us. The bloodline of fire would continue, carried in every flame that pierced the darkness, in every act of creation, in every moment of defiance against the cold. The gods had given fire to the Neanderthals, and through them, fire became life's eternal inheritance. Long after their voices faded into the wind, their warmth remained. It flickered in every hearth, burned in every forge, glowed in every sunrise. Their story was never one of extinction, it was transformation. And through that transformation, the fire they carried would never die. The story begins where it ends, in the silence after the storm, in the soft breath of a world reborn. The ice has melted, the rivers have returned, and the mountains stand bare and glistening beneath a sun that now shines without mercy. The long winter has ended, but its memory still lingers in the soil, in the bones buried beneath it, in the blood of those who walk upon it. The age of fire and frost has passed, yet its echo still hums through every living thing. The Neanderthals, who once gazed at the sky in awe, are gone, but the world they shaped remains. They had lived through 1,000 winters, carried the flame through extinction's shadow, and in doing so, they gave the earth its first true memory. They were not creatures lost to time, they were the bridge between survival and consciousness, between instinct and imagination. In their hands, fire became more than warmth. It became thought, faith, story, and inheritance. The gods they once worshipped had not abandoned them. The gods had become them. Now, in the stillness of a world unburdened by ice, the story of those early people is written not in words, but in what endures. The spark they carried still glows in every hearth, every mind that dreams, every hand that shapes. Humanity itself is the continuation of their covenant. The divine they sought in the thunder, and the stars now lives within the pulse of their descendants, a quiet fire that can create, destroy, and begin again. Nature remembers what they endured. The valleys that were once frozen are lush with green. The caves that sheltered them hold the red handprints of their defiance, marks that still whisper across 40 millennia. We lived. The rivers that drowned their memories now nourish life. The winds that once howled through the glaciers now carry seeds and song. The same elements that threatened to erase them became the canvas upon which they were immortalized. And yet, if one listens closely enough, in the hush of a forest, in the flicker of a flame, in the rumble of a distant storm, there is still an echo. It is faint but persistent, the voice of the gods that once guided trembling hands through fire and shadow. It reminds us that we were never alone in our beginning. Something vast, whether divine or simply the will to endure, moved through those ancient hearts and taught them to survive when the world itself tried to forget them. Science can trace their lineage, measure their bones, reconstruct their faces, and map their DNA within our own. But what it cannot measure is the essence they left behind, the intangible inheritance that lives in the human need to create meaning, to build, to remember. That is the true fire that outlasted the cold. It burns, not in temples of stone, but in the mind, in the soul, in the endless human desire to ask, to seek, to understand. As the narrator returns to the beginning, to that first night when fire fell from the heavens and the sky itself seemed to break open, the meaning becomes clear. The gods did not descend to rule the world. They descended to awaken it. They came as light in the darkness, as warmth in the frozen silence. And through their touch, humanity found itself. The fire they gifted became the soul of a species restless, creative, and eternal. The ice has long since vanished, but its story remains carved into the bones of time. The gods who saved humanity did not fade into myth. They live through us, in every spark of curiosity, every act of endurance, every flicker of imagination. The echo of their creation still travels through the centuries, a reminder that divinity was never beyond reach. It was always within. The gods saved humanity from the ice, and in doing so, they became humanity itself.